fawns prefer, and does, both to give birth and then raising the fawn, but they prefer cover. So we can at least give them that cover, whether it makes a difference in whether they fawn, whether they survive or not.
Let me put it this way then. What can be done, to limit the amount of fawns that coyotes are eating? Do we know? Is there anything?
No.
And there it is.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Deer Grow.
Man, it's almost food plot season, Jared, and Deer Grow is one of those products that has really changed the way that we plant food plots and the success we've seen from them.
No doubt. I've been, trying to plant food plots my entire whitetail hunting career, which is a little shorter than yours. But the minute that I started, or that I realized that I could get Deer Grow back into some of these remote plots where I couldn't get lime or fertilizer, especially in the 50-pound bag, format. So everything was changed. I could get into these spots moving forward with a backpack sprayer, and that's since escalated to these 40 or 60 gallon sprayers, and we're doing upwards of 5 to 10 acre food plots just with Deer Grow and having phenomenal success.
Yeah, and with the price of fertilizer, lime, diesel, everything this year, what better way to get in there and grow a successful food plot at about a third of the cost? Check out Deer Grow at deergrow.com. And we're back.
Hey.
HUNTR Podcast, as Coyote says, episode 72. What is it?
A lot of pressure to remember that.
I know, man. April 28th today. Yeah. So a few days away from May. Crazy. Flying by, man.
Got some more April showers coming here
Sunday.
I know. See that? About an inch.
Mm-hmm. I need to get some. I've got a plot right behind the house that I'm almost ready to plant. I'm hoping.
How much plot prep work I've done.
Zippo.
Nada.
I need to get that clover plot in. I haven't touched anything for summer plots yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping to get that planted before that rain comes.
I think not in lieu of, but it's definitely it's up on the list, is I'm going to make sure that I've got some sites prepped for early successional spraying later this October. So, and that means cutting.
Yep.
So I'm going to choose some sites, and I'm going to make sure that those are cut consistently throughout the year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to end up spraying those in October, November.
Man, we talk about it every year. I'm like, all right, here's my big expectations, and then time just allots for
some
a
of these
third
things,
of them.
It's like a year at a time, and so it's like February, March is usually when I start getting excited about management projects again, especially big ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like finding out, oh crap, like I should have been cutting this for the past year, or I should have sprayed this 2-3 months ago. So the timing is so important, and I've been just missing it so slightly. So now this year I'm finally hopefully going to be ahead on that project.
Yep.
And so that means I'm sacrificing.
And it's a long-term project.
It's a long-term project. I'm sacrificing some early season plots and stuff to do that, which I think is fine.
Yep.
I'm going to end up with maybe some soybean or corn plots, depending on price and availability of my time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm for sure going to have a majority of fall plots.
Yep.
Brassicas, oats,
Yep.
somewhere between peas, and I'm hoping to get that early successional project done along with that.
Well, and I kind of
started.
I deviated a little bit. My goal this year is still food. On my Pennsylvania places where I've deviated from that, in that I've got about 500. Well, I've got about 250 trees left to plant. I've got 250 conifers in the ground. And at the same time, I've got now an additional acre food plot, which is the one I'm trying to get in this weekend. So I've got two tasks there that typically I wouldn't try to focus on cover and adding food in the same year, but it's just how it worked out. Whereas Ohio and Kentucky, I'm almost 100% focused on just adding food in. But the cool thing about your early successional piece and my adding conifers in to provide ground cover is it ties in today's discussion, which is cover is critical. Often you and I are talking about cover being critical in terms of mature bucks and being able to make those mature bucks feel safe and keep them around. But what we don't talk about from a 365 standpoint is that cover is critical for fawn recruitment. Mm-hmm. And so today's guest is Dr. John Kilgo from USDA, but also the Savannah River site is what he's most familiar with, and his research on coyotes and deer depredation. And there's probably nobody listening to this podcast who hasn't encountered some negative thing around coyotes and killing deer and killing deer fawns. Whether that's a deer you shot and you had to leave it lay overnight and you go up and, it's nothing but, rib bones straight up to the neck. Or if you found, pieces of fawn during the late spring and early summer.
Or if you're running trail cam pictures, it's not uncommon
100%.
these days to see a coyote running across the screen with a fawn in his mouth.
Yep. And in the only, coyotes for sure, and John will kind of get into detail here for us in terms of their actual effects and what that looks like from a number standpoint. The only other animal that I know puts on that much of an issue is black bears. And obviously that's only isolated to certain areas of the whitetail range. But my past research and things that I've done, black bears are a giant predator of whitetail fawns. In fact, one of the whitetail guys we were talking to the other day, he said that one of the denning sites that they saw, that mom brought back like 42 fawns throughout the year.
Wow.
Back to that denning site. And so giant impact there. But coyotes are the one that seem to be the big issue. And take it back, 50 and 100 years ago, they probably still were an issue, but trapping was so prevalent, and so many people were trapping that, we were keeping them in check. In today's standpoint, trapping has all but died. I hate saying it because I love it, but there's not many people that are out there running steel. And more and more people thinking, well, I'm going to go call them in. I'm going to use thermal. I'm going to use night vision, which are, able to harvest coyotes, but to the level of an actual effect on the population,
not even close from
an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah.
Right. So I really hope what we get from Dr. Kilgo today is to talk about the effects of coyotes on, mainly on the Savannah River site, but how that's going to be applicable to all of us who own property, who hunt property.
And I'm sure he can teach us a lot more than just, the coyote aspect,
100%.
just fawning in general.
What types of habitats are they seeing more predation in than others? That's a huge one. Here we're talking about your early succession. I'm trying to plant trees. Like everybody's got different habitat types, and obviously certain fawns are more vulnerable in habitat types than others.
Yeah, well, and humans, I'm sure, have a big impact too. Coyotes and black bears are probably rivaled only by a tractor with a brush hog.
Yeah, vehicles.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So. I hope everybody really kind of tunes in on this one, because this is bringing the science of coyote research really as it's tied into recruitment from fawns, which ultimately is going to affect your population. And yeah, let's bring in Dr. John Kilgo. Hey, John, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Doing good, sir. Well, Jared and I appreciate you jumping on the HUNTR Podcast with us today. And, it's something that we hear a lot from the people listening to this and watching this is, effects of predation on their property, large and small, Midwest to Southeast to Northeast. Really doesn't matter where you're at. All of us in some way or another are having some sort of predation on our property. And so I think just to start, if you could maybe give us a little background on yourself and the Savannah River site and some of the research, main topics that you're focusing on, and then we can dive in a little deeper from there.
Sure. Yeah, so the Savannah River site where I work is a Department of Energy property. It's about 300 square miles in the upper coastal plain of South Carolina. And I've been here since 97, I guess, at least in my current job. And somewhere in the early 2000s, I guess, so I'd been doing a variety of things. I'm a research wildlife biologist. I study generally the effects of forest management on wildlife. That can include deer management and deer population studies and such. I was doing a variety of things at the time, but in the early 2000s, I started to need to focus on some deer issues here on Savannah River. And I guess probably I first started noticing something may be going on predation-wise not on Savannah River site, but on a property I hunt, which is nearby, 1,200 acre lease that we've been hunting through the 90s and taking a lot of does. At that time, of course, quality deer management philosophies were taking hold, and Everybody knew they needed to get their herds in balance with the habitat and get sex ratios balanced and all that. So we've been hitting the does pretty hard. Came a point, probably 2001, 2002, we couldn't find any does. And I was thinking, we don't have that many deer. We don't have as many as we thought we did. And we used to, but we didn't at that point, and wondering what was going on. And so then back to Savannah River, looking at what was going on here, which is a very unique situation. We're probably uniquely situated to be able to see what was going on predation wise, because it's a low density herd. It's intentionally managed at a low density. And we had a lot of coyotes. They were still relatively new to the area at the time. And so started wondering what was going on, seeing some things in the way the population was behaving that didn't add up with the way that it had used to, in terms of how quickly it would recover from a heavy harvest, for example. And so started putting some things together, and it went from there, as we really started to take a look at coyote food habits and see, yep, they're eating a lot of them. And then we got into the fawn research in a bigger way. And it all bore out.
And some of that early stuff, John, was it more hunter observation data, or was it more trail camera data that you guys started to, like, obviously, all of us have gone out to a property and, we expect to see a bunch of deer, and, for whatever reason, deer aren't moving. We don't see them, we don't see as many as we think, to kind of really bridge, or I guess confirm that idea of something's going on here. Was it more observation eyeballs in the field, or was it trail cameras that started to kind of provide that data for you?
Well, of course, this was before trail cameras were really very widely available. Mm-hmm. First ones we used still had film in them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would say I was talking about the property I hunt, that was more eyeballs and personal experience, and just wasn't seeing the sign, tracks and other general deer sign. At Savannah River, we're fortunate to have a lot of data, and long-term, it's one of the most studied deer populations in the world. And so we had recruitment data going back to the 1960s, and we're able to look at that kind of thing and see that it dropped off through the 90s as coyotes started to really, their numbers started to take off.
Gotcha.
So there were a variety of things that were different pieces of information that we were able to pull together.
And I think, for most people that understand kind of, say, deer biology at least, the one thing we're kind of taught or informed on is the fact that, these herds can bounce back pretty easily, right? If let's say you take too many does off a property, typically they can bounce back easy. But what you're seeing down there, what we were seeing is that, the predation, I guess, at that time, and assuming it was coyotes, was preventing that herd from being able to bounce back.
That's right. And so the specific year or two that made the difference there, the year 2000, in response to declining harvest, which the cause of which was not understood at the time, the decision was made to not shoot does that year. It was buck only hunt. And then the next year, which was 2001, there were no hunts because of 9/11. That it's a secure site, energy site, and so the hunts were canceled that year. So 2 years of essentially no doe harvest. There were a couple of hunts salvaged at the end of that season, but
right,
a lot of protection. Well, the previous knowledge we had about this population, it should have doubled with 2 years of no harvest, and it didn't. So when in 2002, when the hunts were reinstated, expecting this tremendous harvest, and it was up, but it wasn't nearly what was expected. So that was really the first kicker that said something's changed here. We've got something going on mortality-wise in this population that we need to better understand.
And so at that point, okay, saying something's different, we need to figure out what's going on here. What is the thought process there internally then, on the Savannah River site to say, how do we figure this out? Or is it just formulating a bunch of different hypotheses and start testing them? Or what's kind of the next step there in 2002, 2003?
Yeah, we basically started thinking about everything that might be going on. We didn't have any reason to believe that there was any big AHD outbreak. There were no disease problems. We did look at conception rates and in utero fetal counts to see if maybe it was something going on with the habitat, that they just weren't as productive as they had been. No change from historic information there. And then we started looking at the predation question, which at the time nobody was concerned about.
Right.
Most places, not Savannah River, but most places at that time, of course, had too many deer. But we sort of, by process of elimination, had ruled out the other obvious possibilities for what might be going on. And then when we determined that, the coyotes are eating a lot of fawns, that was kind of a smoking gun, but it didn't prove anything. We knew the coyote numbers had taken off concurrent with this decline, coincident with this decline. Again, it didn't prove anything, but it was circumstantial evidence. And so we needed to, I say the food habits didn't prove anything. We knew they were eating them, but we didn't know they weren't just scavenging dead fawns.
Sure.
So then the only way to get at it from a research standpoint was to track fawns, put radio collars on fawns and see if in fact a bunch of them are dying, and if they are, why are they dying? What's killing them? And
so that in that next step, were you guys just walking through and looking for fawns, or were you using the actual transmitters from the doe side that when that fawn drops, that transmitter comes out and you can go and pinpoint?
Yeah, and in some parts of the country, you can find enough fawns just by
walking,
getting a crew of people and walking and finding them. But around here, that doesn't work. Not just because of the low density, but just the dense cover.
Sure.
And so, at the time, fortunately, the vaginal implant transmitters had come out. So you catch the doe in the winter, implant her, and then when the fawn's born, that the fawn being born pushes that transmitter out, and it gives a different signal.
What?
Yeah, you never heard of those before?
No.
Yeah, and so that's because think about it. I mean, a doe has a fawn. It's like finding a shed. It's a needle in the haystack type of thing. And so, were you capturing those deer with rocket nets in the winter?
Yeah, we use rocket nets some initially, but that turned out to be a 7-year study, and we ended up catching most of them with dart guns.
You were. So dart them, sedate them, and then they would implant a transmitter. And so that when the fawn comes out, it pushes that transmitter out. And once it comes out, it starts releasing a signal, which triggers you to say, go find it.
Okay.
Yep. And then.
So it just pushes it out. It's not connected to the fawn.
Correct. Just pushes it out. And then it sends a signal, which tells you to go and search that area for the fawns.
Very cool.
And I guess at that point, John, you guys now, assuming that trigger happens, you go out, you find, 2 fawns in most cases, or a fawn, you're now reconfirming those conception rates, right? Of we have 2 fawns that have now hit the ground that we are now collaring. So
fawns on the ground.
between now and when they hit 6 months, that's when we're losing them.
Right. And mostly between 3 or 4 weeks between birth and it says first few weeks that are the really critical period.
So in that first, first field year of having those fawns collared, was it kind of like oh wow that you started to see pretty quickly?
Yeah, well, the first year was sort of a pilot effort to see if we could. So you got to catch a bunch of these fawns to get a reliable survival rate across the population.
And when you say a bunch, how many are you saying in your area?
Preferably 30 or 40 a year.
Wow.
And then for multiple years.
Yep.
And if you can catch 50 or 60, all the better.
Wow.
The more you get, the more representative a sample you have of what's going on in the population.
Mm-hmm.
So that first year, we just wanted to make sure we could find them, that the technology worked, those implant transmitters and all that. And so we only implanted, we only caught 5 fawns. 4 of those 5 were killed by coyotes. So
holy cow. Wow.
Well, that was, that's a really small sample size.
Maybe there's a correlation between the fact that you were able to find them. The moms didn't drop them in a good spot or something.
Well, that's another question we can talk about. But no, these are presumably a representative sample of does. We catch them and we find their fawn. And so we get a fawn off of almost every doe. Sometimes the transmitter doesn't work right.
Yep.
We have the ability to find them no matter how well concealed they are. We're using thermal imaging cameras to, and usually if we get there quickly enough, within 6 hours or so, they're still at the birth bed where they were born. So they're not, between the nature of that sample and the technology that we've got, they're not able to do anything to outsmart us, I guess.
And how were you, so 4 fawns died. How did you know that it was coyote predation, or how did you come to the conclusion that fawn died from coyote predation versus it died and was scavenged, I guess?
So you basically see where to start. The collar has a mortality signal on it. Okay. So these are old-fashioned VHF collars that you have to go out with an antenna and listen for. And when the collar hasn't moved for 4 hours, you can program it for different periods, but we were using 4 hours. You assume the fawn's dead. And so when you hear that mortality signal, you go track to the fawn, the carcass, or the collar, if there's any carcass left there. And when you find the carcass, then you have to basically investigate to see look for any sign around. The most telling of which is the way the carcass is cached, hidden by the predator. So here, all we've got is bobcats and coyotes. Yep. No black bears. Cats, of course, will just scrape leaf litter, sticks, anything they can. They just scrape it over the top of it. Coyote will actually bury it. Usually, they don't always, but they will bury it in the dirt. So if the dirt is disturbed, that's a telltale sign it was a coyote.
Interesting.
Like a dog digging a bone.
Yep.
Burying a bone. And then, other things, tracks and scat and other stuff you may find around the area. But because that's not 100% absolutely correct, we also collected residual predator saliva from the carcass. Basically take a Q-tip and swab the bite wounds, and whether you can see any wet saliva on it or not, it's there. And then you can get DNA out of that and see who it was, a bobcat or a coyote or whatever it might be.
Interesting.
And that always confirmed the field determination. So by field determination, I'm talking about the sign that was present there.
Sure.
So that's pretty good sign in and of itself without having to do the DNA thing.
Wow. And so you've got 5 samples that year. You kind of say, all right, we've got a problem. So the next year it expands at this point?
Yeah, well, that got people's attention. Yeah. So we got funding from the state, and we got funding locally here from Department of Energy and Forest Service to do it at a bigger scale. And it turned out that 80% mortality rate basically bore out over the 7 years, and it was amazingly consistent from year to year. Look at it in the inverse. The inverse of mortality is survival. So we averaged about 20 to 25% survival across all the fawns that we collared.
Wow.
And it didn't vary much from year to year.
What percentage of the mortality? I realize it was 4 out of 5 were coyotes in the 5 that you found the first year, but at a bigger scale, what percentage of fawn mortality is coyotes?
Well, in this study, so that first year it was 100%.
Okay.
But across the 200 and some odd fawns that we tracked over the course of the 7 years, it was about 80%.
Holy cow.
Coyotes.
Bobcats take about 10%, and then you've got various miscellaneous other accidents, and had one drown.
Well, we were speculating, I think, just as we were introing the podcast here, that I would guess that like the human element is as big as coyotes. Like I would think getting run over with a brush hog, I would say almost as many.
Yeah, or a vehicle in some areas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that certainly happens. Out here, I think we only had one fawn that was hit by a car. It's just the difference in the landscape here is mostly forested and not very, there's a lot of traffic when employees come on and off site every day, but most of the fawns were well away from roads, so they weren't really at risk getting hit by a car.
Can I ask you, John, does that, you said it's 300 square miles, is a portion of that farmed, or, are there people on it, or?
There are industrial activities that the Department of Energy's main mission here that comprise probably 6 to 8% of the land area. The rest of it is managed forest, pine forest.
So I guess I would like just speculate in an area like where I'm at in Ohio, and we have a bunch of coyotes.
Mm-hmm.
I bet a much larger percentage of fawn deaths are from farming activities.
Mm-hmm. Like
maybe not more than coyotes, but more than the area that John's studying.
Well, and so the question I was going to kind of follow up on that 7-year study there was, what were those habitats that you started to see? Because that's the next thing, right? And again, I guess it's sample related, but like, did you see certain areas of that property or certain habitat types of that property have fawns, I guess, more vulnerable than others?
Yeah, what I assumed going in was that fawns that lived in denser cover were going to do better.
Yeah, that's what I would think.
Whether that was the ground layer or understory,
Yep.
And so we compared the density of the understory for fawns that lived and fawns that died of predation, and there was absolutely no difference.
Wow.
So, which was a real head scratcher. But there was nothing there. And so then we backed out to landscape scale and looked at the structure. So for example, there are a lot of utility rights of way out here, power lines and gas lines and whatnot.
Yep.
Roads. And with the forest management, you get edges between a clear cut or young plantation and older forest. And so what we found then was that fawns with more edge in their home range were more likely to survive. We think of coyotes and other predators as well, hunting edges, and they do. But all we could conclude was that if there's over a threshold amount of edge, it's just too much for them to hunt. And so fawns with a lot of edge did better than fawns in contiguous, extensive, open or closed canopy forest.
Well, and when you start thinking about the predation on the fawns, the first things I think of, and a lot do, is like, you talk about, I guess, like a fawn being scentless, right? Being able to avoid predation by not having scent on it.
Is that true?
It's what you hear. I don't know.
Well, they can't be completely scentless.
Yeah, it can't be true.
But they do. The doe in particular minimizes scent by the way she grooms them. When they're really young, she consumes their waste. So, and they move their bed from time to time, so they don't concentrate scent in a certain area. But yeah, I mean, they're an animal; they got some scent.
And then you talk about what is the bradycardia, that essentially they can slow their heart rate extremely low, to potentially
Chris Angel.
Yeah, to eventually to basically avoid that predation.
Interesting.
And so those are internal defenses essentially against predation, and yet here we are still saying 80% of the fawns we find dead are from coyotes. Regardless of cover even. So again, you talk about ultimate predator, like these coyotes are finding these fawns. It seems like no matter where they're at.
Yeah, and we don't have any idea how they're finding. You may hear a story of somebody observing a coyote taking a fawn, but again, that's more anecdotal. We don't see these fawns that we have collared very often, and we certainly don't see the actual predation event itself. So whether the coyote is sniffing them out in their bed or doing something, following the doe, keying on some behavior that she's leading him to the coyote to the fawn, we don't know how they find them, whether they just get lucky and stumble on them in their bed. And that would be, I think, important information, at least if there was something we could do to mitigate their strategy.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Hoyt Archery.
Dude, where would we be without our Hoyt bows?
Probably shooting crossbows.
or a Matthews. Yeah.
One and the same.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, we love being Hoyt guys because you stand out. When you're in this room full of other people that shoot these other types of bows, I feel like the Hoyt guys just stick out.
Dude, it's just a legit bow. I mean, especially that carbon riser, man. I mean, I know that they've got several other aluminum lines as well, but for me, I'm shooting that RX5 in the carbon model. They've since come out with the RX7, and I can't tell you how much I love being a Hoyt guy amongst a sea full of Matthews guys. So we're out there, I think, proving them wrong, shooting 80 pounds and killing stuff.
Hey, man, if you want to get serious, get Hoyt. Yeah,
I think like it's hard to put yourself in the mindset of like a wild animal, but like we do this for mature bucks when we're hunting. You know, you see them stand there to see them stand there and stare at you to try to figure something out for what seems like an impossible, like an eternity. You know, like we're like waiting and we're shaking. Same is true for coyotes. The only thing that these deer have to do, or that these coyotes have to do, is survive. That's they're not worried about, I have this thing later on, I got to check the emails. They just survive. That's all they do. So these coyotes are just constantly hunting.
Yeah.
And these fawns are just constantly trying to survive.
Well, and that's I guess where my curiosity is if you think about the coyotes, like what now almost becomes the hunting behavior of these coyotes.
So this is a good time for this. This is just my anecdotal, I guess, my observation that my parents own a good chunk of ground in eastern central Ohio, and it's okay deer hunting, but it's great summer habitat. You know, we have a lot of deer there in the summer, and I think for the same reason that habitat is consistent with, we have a lot of fawns. It's a lot of old pasture, and the grass will grow however tall in the summer until it gets cut later on, and so we see lots of fawns. And so in our situation, we have I see a lot of coyotes. Almost every time I go out, I see a coyote or two. Mm-hmm. And we also have a lot of deer. Too many, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And we try to do both. We try to shoot coyotes and we try to shoot does. Mm. And our research is obviously not as scientific as it could be. But I would speculate that it's because we have so much summer habitat, fawning habitat, that like they're able to do. The coyotes just can't. There's such vast open fawning habitat, tall grass type of setups that's where we find them, that they can't possibly find them all.
Yeah, I would assume that's it, John, right? I mean, that's the key, is that essentially there needs to be a certain number of fawns that hit the ground at any given time, and some of those will be vulnerable. They're all vulnerable to predation, but eventually the coyotes can only eat so many of them, and the other ones get past that critical mark of being able to have some escape.
Yeah, that's the idea we talk about in terms of predator swamping, where you concentrate the rut and therefore the fawning season, where they're all hitting the ground at once, and predators can only take so many.
Yep.
I would point out that if you've ever been in a southeastern river swamp where it's thick switch cane and saw palmetto or smooth palmetto, there's plenty of cover out there, and it's every bit as much a needle in the haystack, a fawn living in that, as in a vast hayfield. The interesting thing that we don't really have much of an explanation for is that in that area that you're talking about, well, throughout the Midwest and a lot of the Northeast, predation rates are really pretty low. It's the South, and particularly the Southeast, where we've seen these really high predation rates. And why that is, maybe there's a lot more mice in those fields for coyotes to live on.
I've noticed that too. There's tons of mice.
Yeah. Whatever the cause, predation isn't that big a deal in in that part of the world.
It's interesting that you say that. Driving around our property, I've often thought, man, it would be so easy to be a coyote. There's mice everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I think what's kind of
I could just run up and catch them.
You talk about
I've got bit before.
Yeah, the predator swamping aspect of it is that, my experience was living in Mississippi for 4 or 5 years. But I would see in certain parts of Mississippi there were, I'd see bucks breeding does in November, and I'd still see bucks breeding does in February. And so if you think about that, there's fawns hitting the ground then from, June to September. And because it's so spread out, essentially I would say that those coyotes can eat more fawns during the fawning season because the fawning season is longer in that area. And I don't think we see that as much in the Midwest and Northeast, where because of weather conditions and stuff, most of our fawns, like here in Pennsylvania or Ohio, are dropping May, June, and maybe you get a trickle into early July, but very few.
Is that the case though? Because they're not breeding any slower because there's fewer does. They just have to expand the time that they're breeding because there's more of them. So you're still going to have just as many, but for a longer period of time.
That's the age-old question of the Southeast is it genetics that are driving this spread out, I call it a trickle rut down there, that, there's breeding in November and there's breeding clear till February, or is the buck to doe ratio so out of whack that, does are getting missed and they're coming back into cycle every 28 days?
I guess I'm assuming the second is true. Is that... I didn't realize that was up
in terms of buck to doe ratio.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's genetic issues too. Like if you look at a state, I don't know if South Carolina is like that, but I know Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, those long states essentially. In the northern part, it may be breeding in mid-November, and the southern part, it's February.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the Gulf coastal states have that later rut that, like you say, is December, January, February.
Mm-hmm.
Here in most of Georgia, actually, except for southwestern Georgia, it's more along the lines of what you see throughout the rest of the country. So it really kicks in mid-October, peaks in late October, early November, and it's done in early December for the most part. Here. We get some breeding as early September. The earliest fawn in that study that we had was born on April 1st.
Holy cow.
Most of them are not until late May. Mid to late May is the peak.
Yeah.
Which is what you see in a lot of the rest of the country.
I wonder, I don't think the area that you study there is necessarily between either of those two. You mentioned the Gulf coastal states is where they had the late rut. I wonder how the coyote populations are affected by that. Like if the ones that are on the verge, if they travel, like they fawn here,
they move,
and then they move to where the fawns are at.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. We did a study in Louisiana, northeast Louisiana, I think, but there were black bears there, and so bears, coyotes, and bobcats all did their share of damage on the fawn crop.
Yeah.
They've been there a little bit longer. Coyotes moved eastward across the continent. It's I don't know what's going on in different parts of the range in terms of their learning ability over time or the ability of deer to adapt to it. But
I mean, I guess that
here.
Yeah, the feeling is though, okay, so now we understand that these coyotes are having a huge impact on the herd. I would assume the same thing is now that there's a positive impact if depending on how you look on the coyote populations, right? I mean, because if they're consuming all this food and being an efficient predator, you would think that these populations of coyotes, along with, we kind of opened this up, John, as we're not living in the 50 to 100 years ago when trapping was so prevalent that a lot of us did it. It's almost an obsolete thing anymore to run into trappers out there. How have these coyote populations now exploded in many parts of the country, which then obviously is putting even more pressure on the fawn recruitment?
Well, they moved in, depending on where you are, they were, like I said, they're moving eastward. So they were in Georgia before they were in South Carolina, for example. But when they showed up in South Carolina, they, in a matter of 10 years, had covered the state every county had coyotes, and then their numbers went up. They've peaked probably 10 years ago and more or less stabilized numbers wise across the state of South Carolina. We have here the sale of live coyotes is legal. So it basically created a market, whereas the fur doesn't draw any or bring any money worthwhile anymore, at least relative to northern furs. You can sell a live coyote to running pen where they chase them with dogs in the big enclosures, and at one time you could get close to $100 or more for a live coyote. So that created a market. I think there are a few other states that have that. So there, in some places, there is a fair amount of trapping of coyotes. But yeah, you're right. For the most part, trapping is going away. And but nevertheless, there's only so many that are going to be able to be on the landscape. That their social organization is somewhat limiting. A dominant or an alpha breeding pair is only going to allow so many others in their territory, and so you get more transients moving across the area. And that's why when you trap a coyote out or shoot a breeder, another's going to come right in almost immediately and take that space. But that's kind of a self-regulating, or whether it's that or anything else, the resource available to them. There are only so many that are going to be able to persist.
Yeah, you've got that sponge effect. If you have the resources, you remove one, another can move in easily. So, in a case like Savannah River, where, all right, now you've observed this 80% mortality caused by coyotes, did you guys look at any removal or habitat improvements? I mean, how are you now saying, all right, well, we want to counter this, or we want to change this because obviously our recruitment's only 20%. What kind of activities have you all looked at?
Well, the short answer is reduce the harvest, particularly of does. What is sustainable now is about a quarter of what historically was taken from the deer population here. Deer management is not the goal here. In fact, I said this is a unique place. The objective of the deer hunts here is to keep the population down in order to minimize the number of deer vehicle accidents because of all the employees, 10,000 people coming on and off site every day. So it's all safety driven, and managing for a quality herd or big bucks is not the objective. And so if coyotes help out with it, then the powers that be don't care. But one artifact of, just as an aside, the way the hunts are structured here, a lot of it is dog drive hunting, and they hunt one unit, or any given unit is only hunted once a year. So if the deer survive, and there are a lot of dogs running around out there that day, but if they can survive that gauntlet, they make it for another year, unless they get hit by a car. And so the buck, the deer age structure is very good, and there are a lot of really old deer out here, and therefore a lot of really big deer out here. So it's a desirable place to hunt, but it's not intentionally managed to do anything other than control the numbers.
Interesting. I mean, if you're looking at that from a standard situation, I guess, we hear it a lot. People will say, well, I've got coyotes are killing all my fawns, and their instant pull is to go out and try to shoot them, right? I mean, and it seems logical, but from an efficiency standpoint, I mean, anybody that's actually gone out and called coyotes at night and hunted coyotes, it's not efficient. It's extremely labor intensive to go out there and remove some coyotes off a property.
And you've got to remove so many that it's just almost impossible to do it at a scale that will have any effect on. So I guess to more directly answer your question earlier, the last 3 years of that project, we did trap coyotes. and tried to remove as many as we could. Hired professional trappers to do it, and we took out a lot of coyotes, and then looked at how fawn survival responded. And in spite of taking out more than we thought were even there to begin with, 1 year we got a bump in survival, not as much as we had expected, but it improved. The next year, after taking out more coyotes, it was as if we hadn't done anything at all. It was back to that baseline 20-25% survival. And then after the third year of again taking out more coyotes, it was sort of intermediate. So The conclusion there is that it took a tremendous amount of money and effort and manpower to remove a lot of coyotes 3 years running, and the response was inconsistent.
Holy cow!
Roughly how many coyotes were you guys taking out?
The total was 475, I think.
In the first year?
No, that was total.
Over 3 years?
That's not off of all 300 square miles. That's off of it was 3 areas, each of which were about 8,000 acres. So a total of, let's say, 25,000 acres.
Okay.
Wow.
And that's 4 to 5 coyotes per square mile that were removed each year.
And not bump it. So, I mean, literally in that sense, after seeing that, the only way to continue to increase a deer population, if that's the desire, is don't shoot as many deer.
Well, that's weird though. Like, because doesn't that conflict with, the finding that 80% of the mortality is because of coyotes?
Well, it would seem to, but the problem is, as many as we took off, we didn't get them all. And the ones that we didn't get were probably the oldest, smartest ones that are the most experienced hunters, fawn hunters. But on top of that, you get more coyotes moving in all the time. Like I said, just you take one out and another or 3 are going to take its place. And so the numbers recover so quickly that the coyote caused predation was still there. So it wasn't 80%, but it was still higher than you would expect, having removed so many coyotes.
So
now there are cases where people have done it over the long term, year in, year out, and they've got the means to do it right, and you can see a benefit. But it's beyond the means of most landowners. Yeah. Certainly, somebody hunting on a couple hundred acres.
So I assume it's probably a little bit of both. But like, would you assume that those two things are indicating that one, either a small percentage of the coyote population is extremely effective at hunting, or that the place of the coyotes that you're harvesting are getting filled very quickly from surrounding areas?
Well, certainly the latter. And we demonstrated that with the various genetic testing of the animals that came in, that the next year they weren't related to the animals that we took out the first year.
Interesting.
As far as how many of them are participating, we don't know, but I think the breeding pair are the most motivated because they've got to feed their pups.
Mm-hmm.
They're all hungry, but the breeding pair tends to be older and therefore more experienced. Another thing we saw, by the way, was that talking about this long fawning season, fawns born after the midpoint of the season were pretty much toast.
Really?
The later you're born, the lower your chances of making it. And in the north, that's because you're not going to be big enough come wintertime, and
right.
groceries aren't going to support you. Well, here you don't even get to the winter because coyotes get you.
When is the coyote breeding season? So when is that?
I think January.
That breeding
February,
pair, I guess. Like, when is she pregnant? Thinking that she's gotta going through gestation and she's got to consume as much, and then eventually when the pups are born for nursing. Does that overlap?
Well, February is peak breeding. It's January to March, and then their gestation is like a dog. It's about 2 months,
okay,
60 days, I think. So they're born. Pups are born on average in April, and then they're whelping or coming out of the den at early June, and which is right after the peak of the fawn drop. So yeah, and she's feeding herself and them while they're in the den.
Yep.
But yeah, it coincides.
So those two peaks basically collide in that we've got, most of the fawns hitting the ground at the same time she's in den nursing pups, and then when those pups come out of den, now we're hitting that latter half of the fawning season, and probably why most of those fawns are toast.
Here,
it makes sense, yeah.
So here I've got a question and consequent observation on my place.
Mm-hmm.
It's we got a lot of livestock in our area as well, and a lot of cows die.
Mm-hmm.
And there's constantly, I'll see a dead cow in a field. I wonder, if a coyote has an alternative food source to fawns, like a dead cow
for scavenging.
Yeah, I mean, you think that would improve your fawning your success rate?
Well, the correlate we have here on Savannah Riverside is wild pigs, which are the subject of a control program that leaves a lot of pig carcasses in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
And you find a lot of hog hair in coyote scab, and yet they're still killing fawns.
Jeez.
Actually, the number one food item in their diet during summer on into the fall is fruit, soft mass. Fawns are number two.
Coyotes, their number one is soft mass?
Coyotes eat, a lot of, blackberries and blueberries, wild plums, and then, get on into late summer and
making me hungry.
Persimmons and muscadines start whatever plant is fruiting at that time of year.
Interesting. But
they need the protein.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, you would think, you would hope, I guess, that if they did have a cow carcass or a hog carcass, that would fill them up.
But it doesn't seem to divert them away.
Do coyotes eat like corn and soybeans? I mean, if they're eating soft mass, do they eat ag crops?
I think they do. We didn't really have any available here. I haven't ever seen that as a important.
They're omnivores, but
I see them in soybean fields all the time, pushing deer out.
Well, it becomes, you go back to that like early successional growth and stuff in the Midwest and the Northeast. In a lot of those areas, you've got really good stands of, black raspberry or blackberry and things like that probably help at least to curb the diet a little bit versus some of these old growth areas that, there's nothing to eat on. And the deer don't have anything to eat, 6 feet and under. So the coyotes surely don't either, except for rodents and fawns.
I mentioned that second year of trapping where we saw no benefit to fawns from the trapping. One purely speculative explanation for that was that it was a real dry summer, and there was pretty much a bust on the soft mass crop.
Mm-hmm.
There were no blackberries out there. And so did fawns sort of take it in the pants because they were extra hungry? There's a very different nutritional value between a blackberry and a fawn, but if they're hungry, then
they're hungry.
I've never heard it
but
put that way
full,
before. So John, in any of the pine areas on Savannah Riverside, are you guys doing prescribed burns and still like in that new regrowth and stuff? We're still not seeing differences in essentially, survival because of better early successional habitat?
Yes, to the burning. There's a lot of burning done here. And no, it doesn't seem to make a difference.
It's crazy. Because there's a ton of money spent if you would encounter people who hunt, a big lease or own big property or whatever, they would say that they put an absorbent amount of effort into controlling, in quotes, the coyote population to increase their deer population. And most of those guys are probably killing, half dozen, maybe a dozen at the most, per year over the course of, 10,000 acres, via guns, which are very labor intensive, and thermals. But in their minds, no doubt they will tell you it's making a difference. But I would assume that if they actually looked at the research, it did it, scientifically, there would be no research to support that they're actually having an effect.
Well, and there have been a couple of other studies that have looked at predator control or coyote control in particular, and whether it benefited fawn survival, and the results are as inconsistent as what I said we saw here. Some years you can do some good, but there's certainly no guarantee. There is a guarantee it's going to take a lot of time and effort and money to do it. So it's not a safe bet.
That being the case, from like somebody who's trying to manage for their deer herd, it seemed like a better use of time to invest in habitat improvements, like providing additional food sources that may provide cover for fawns and potentially also food for coyotes, like plant apple trees.
Yeah, I would say we know that deer need food to eat. We know that we can supplement that either through planting an apple tree or burning and timber stand improvement to let more light hit the ground and stimulate the understory. We don't know that that's going to translate into more fawns surviving. Like I said, there was no correlation between the amount of cover available to a fawn and whether it was going to make it or not. But we do know that fawns prefer, and does, both to give birth and then raising the fawn, but they prefer cover. So we can at least give them that cover, whether it makes a difference in whether they whether they survive or not.
Let me put it this way then. What can be done, to limit the amount of fawns that coyotes are eating? Do we know? Is there anything?
No.
And there it is. I think one of the things that's interesting about it, I'll take the side of early successional habitat work, whether it's prescribed burning or doing old field management. The one thing that I think we probably are confident in is if we increase those areas in early successional habitat or old fields, we likely increase the amount of other sources of food, whether it's blackberries and stuff, or in my opinion, it's, moles, voles, rabbits, things that prefer that early successional type growth, to then again, try to offset, the pressure on just the fawn population. Now, whether that actually makes a lick of difference or not, who knows? But, I would assume like if there's a bunch of rabbits and moles and voles running around in, early successional habitat, they've got just as much of a chance to get eaten as the fawn does, and maybe they're easier to catch. I don't know.
Well, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about like hunting habits of coyotes, like is it purely situational? Like they're just up and cruising? Like I assume they're not specifically seeking out fawns as much as they are just cruising known travel routes and happening upon food, whether it's a fawn laying there or, like you said,
carcass or rabbit or whatever,
soft mass, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish we knew more about that. We know that they're coursing predators, meaning that they're not ambush predators like bobcats.
Yep.
But I don't think that they don't, these 2-week-old fawns and 1-week-old fawns that they're getting, they're not running them down, but those fawns are in the hiding.
They're happening upon them. Yeah.
Now, whether they happen on them while the fawn's up nursing and they see the doe and go to that, or they find them we don't know.
Yeah.
But yes, they are.
Probably. That's how I usually find fawns, is there's a doe acting weird.
Yeah, and it's
I'm like,
there.
she's...
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Stealth Cam.
Dude, where would we be without our cell cams?
I would definitely be divorced at this point.
Yeah, I hear that.
I mean, the fact is I spent more time checking cameras than I actually did hunting prior to cell cameras. Now, at least, my wife can enjoy me being in the comfort of my own home, buried in my phone, checking those pictures.
Yeah, 100%. And dude, when it comes to trail cameras and definitely cell cameras, reliability is, I think, the number one thing that we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else. We've tried them all. There's other companies that make good cameras, but the fact is they all fail at some point. we have had such great success on a big variety. I mean, you and I ran over 30 cell cameras last year with Stealth Cam, and we hardly had any issues whatsoever. And the issues that we did have are probably self-inflicted. So in terms of reliability, there's not a better camera on the market than Stealth Cam. Has anybody started to look at collaring coyotes, I guess, and looking at their travel routes and behaviors and home ranges and stuff?
Yeah, there have been quite a few telemetry studies of coyotes, and we're learning more and more about them, habitat use and movements, and this business of the dominant breeding pair versus transients moving across the landscape. And so, yeah, there's a lot known about that. And of course, out west, where you can sit on one ridge and watch the coyote forage on the other ridge, we know a lot about coyotes and how they hunt there. What we don't know is, where we can't see them here in the densely forested east, are those hunting methods the same, or are they doing something different? Because they're very smart, they're very adaptable, they've clearly been successful. If it takes something different, a different strategy, then they may well have figured that out. We're not sure what that looks like.
Coincidentally, my wife just texted me and found what's left of a rabbit from right behind the house at our woods. And we've got a ton of red fox, like they're all over my trail cameras. So, and the red fox have killed our chickens in the past. So I assume that's what got that rabbit. But it's like, just a tufts of fur here and there. And
all right. So that begs another question is, I've heard time and time again that, like, where you find coyotes, you're not going to find fox because they run them off or they eat them or whatever. And I'll tell you, that's not the case at our farm at all. I see a lot of coyotes and a lot of fox and a lot of does.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting when you get into it, and this is probably different, John, where you're at versus as we move into, let's say, the upper Midwest or even in the New England states, I hear it's hunter observation, right? So immediately you have to intake that there's bias in the observations that are happening. But you hear, people talk about hunting packs of coyotes, not wolves, of coyotes, taking down adult deer late in the wintertime and things like that. So I guess when you get back to those behaviors, those hunting behaviors of coyotes, I mean, first of all, any of us who have ever seen a coyote, whether we're in a tree stand or whatever, you watch that coyote work woods, and I mean, they cover a ton of ground quick, and at all times, like all senses on full alert. And I've seen and found, usually probably a struggling 6-month-old fawn in February or March that probably was worn down to nothing, and you see the coyote tracks, and then you start finding blood, and eventually you find the carcass, right? It took it down. So, I would assume it's situational, and probably because of the way that coyote breeding, gestation, and then eventually, having the pups intersects with that fawning side. I mean, the fact is the more you can either swamp that time frame with fawns on the ground, or somehow, drop fawns earlier or later to get away from that, which isn't really necessarily possible. You're not going to move the, anatomy and biology of a whitetail to shift it one way or the other. It really comes down to, if you want more deer on your property, you either have to not shoot as many, so there's more does, and then hopefully have a tighter fawning season so that it drops as many as possible in that time frame. You're still going to lose a bunch, but hopefully more made it through versus a trickle of them dropping.
All right, so here's the wrench in your plan. The way to get a smaller breeding pen is to shoot more does.
You're right. Or shoot less bucks.
Yeah, I guess.
It's true. I mean, the hard part about it is, and obviously it's not a one size fits all, but John, you talked about QDM and that mindset of balancing the herd and taking does off and letting bucks get older. That in itself is all well and good, especially if we're trying to balance the buck to doe ratio. But there are properties, and especially if you don't communicate with your neighbors, that are probably harvesting way too many does because you don't know what neighbor A is doing and neighbor B is doing. And because of that, you've shot a ton of them, and your herd can't rebound as if we're all bred to think that herd can bounce back quickly. And the fact is if you've got an intense coyote population in an area, it won't.
Yeah, it's going to take longer anyway. It can, but when you're just not making that many more fawns a year, not adding any, and especially if you're still shooting some does, it's just going to take longer. But you can get there. It's a matter of balancing what you're taking and what's being added through those fawns that do survive. And of course, it's hard to know that without study. But you can, through camera surveys and looking at lactation rates and things like that, you can get a sense of how low you might be in terms of survival recruitment. The evidence for our ability to shrink the rut, basically, by balancing the sex ratio is not real strong.
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
And so in some places and in the right conditions, it'll work, but there's no guarantee that we can shrink the rut and thereby shrink the fawning season. The only thing that's completely in our control is the trigger. And if we back off on shooting does, then more does are going to make it through the winter. More fawns are going to be born the next year. Even if the same percentage of them are going to die, if more of them hit the ground, then more of them are going to make it through. And it might take a while. It might take longer than it used to take. But you can get there eventually.
I think your statement or your findings about taking out large number of coyotes and seeing how little that affected coyote numbers the following year, and consequently, survival rate. Yeah, that begs the question: is the same true for deer? Does our harvest of them, is it essentially irrelevant? Do they just move in from other areas, or do they get replaced? Can you have an impact on the number of them and therefore the breeding cycle?
Well, obviously we did at one point, when back early part of the 20th century, when there were no deer around. And then after restocking, we had too many deer through the 70s, 80s, 90s. And we used to say back then, we can't kill enough of them. But now with this additional mortality source, it fawns, we can overharvest.
Yep.
And that's what we've seen in numerous places. We thought we needed to keep taking does and keep taking does, and we took too many because we didn't know the fawns weren't many.
Right.
So there is a difference then between coyotes and deer in that sense, because we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to kill as many coyotes as possible, and it's not having the same effect as when we tried to kill as many deer as possible.
I would assume it's because the landscape level of deer harvest versus the landscape level of coyote killing harvest.
Well, yeah, but John's doing it on 300 square acres. That's a pretty big
and
trial.
Still sucking them in from around. Yeah, I think what's interesting about it is, so if you want to keep, let's say you're happy with your deer population and assume you've got a 20% survival rate, which isn't the case in all areas. There's some areas
go for 5 or 10 more booners.
There's, in Midwest or Northeast, maybe it's a little bit higher. You can remove 20% of that population, and assuming next year your population won't change because you will have added 20% fawns back into it, right?
Sure.
So I think what ends up being tricky is, like, as you move into some of these areas, let's take our area here in Pennsylvania, we've got probably a very large impact by coyotes, bobcats some, and then black bears on top of that.
Forget about mountain lions.
Yeah, right. And the vehicles. The question is, John, do you think that the predators in that case, when you add black bears or whatever into it, and this is just a generalized thing, not necessarily a specific case, do you think that they're taking more fawns, or they're taking about the same amount of fawns? It's just divided up amongst the predators proportionally. the latter. So they're not like, we probably don't have less than a 20% survival rate. It's just those 80% are consumed between black bears, bobcats, and coyotes, not just one predominantly.
Right. That Louisiana study I mentioned, where bears and coyotes and bobcats were all taking them, roughly the same survival rate. Studies in Minnesota and Upper Peninsula, Michigan, where you got wolves on top of those other three, still, they're not taking any more overall. They're just dividing them up.
That right there, compared with some of the things you said earlier, I think points to the fact that some fawns, not I'm sure intentionally, but some fawns or some does that are having those fawns are doing something right. Like the ones that are surviving, what are they doing right? Because, because it's not just coyotes, it's not just people. You're saying regardless of
more than regardless luck of the draw,
regardless of how many there are or how many different species of predators there are, there's X percentage that will survive. What are those ones doing right?
Well, they may not be doing anything right. They may just be the numbers that the predators can't get to. The predators are satiated. But I think there are some things. We're starting to see some things. So I just finished analyzing some data that I presented at that deer study group back in February that shows that some individual does are more successful year in and year out than others. And it doesn't have to do with how old they are. Then it's not that they're learning how to be a better mother as they get more experience. Some of them, their first year, they successfully raise a fawn. And others that are 7, 8 years old have twins and lose them both every year. What are they doing right? We don't know. But we have another study right now. A graduate student at Clemson, Mike Mothersbaugh, has does and fawns collared, and he's looking at the behavior of the does and how often they come to feed the fawn, how far away they stay from the fawn, what time of day they come, and he's starting to see some differences. This is preliminary, and he's still working on it, but there do seem to be some behaviors that lend themselves to helping the fawn make it.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, we looked at it more in captive animals when I was at Mississippi State, but most of those deer had wild origins, meaning we had captured them from the wild, then we had placed them in individual research pens. And there would be certain ones like we had a really bad EHD outbreak in 2007, I believe. And we lost a lot of does when they were still nursing fawns, and we would see just certain does actually call it adopt or take in those abandoned fawns and start nursing them as their own. We'd have other fawns, we'd have other does, especially yearlings, ones that would be the first year of having a fawn, that almost seemed like they completely abandoned their fawn, and we'd find their fawn dead. Like they didn't know what to do with it. And so I'm sure, just like anything, there's individual variation there. I don't know if there's ever been research around it, but I've often heard it's rare, but it can happen that does will have triplets, right? I've seen a lot of people say, that oftentimes if you see a doe with triplets or even quadruplets, that, that doe may have picked up those fawns from another doe that, essentially wasn't caring for them. So I think you will see that.
I've seen does with 3 fawns. Well,
yeah. And I mean, it can happen naturally, but oftentimes, like, doe gets hit by a car, that fawn's abandoned, maybe another fawn picks it up. I'm sure, just like any animals, there's, you see it with dogs, there's a motherly instinct there that ends up kicking in. But I agree. I think that it's hard to tease apart, right, when you're actually looking at the research data, but, there are probably certain does in certain areas that know how to take care of their fawn and where to take them to avoid predation. Does that mean that they avoid it 100% of the time? No, I'm sure they lose fawns. But I'm sure those old wise does probably are very successful at trying to raise them, but who knows?
So that's what you just said. There's 7, 8-year-old does that are losing them every year.
I know, it's crazy.
There's got to be something to it. You know what I mean? There's a reason that there's a certain percentage that are successful despite.
But it may not be I would assume that So John, I would guess that when you captured a doe and put one of the VITs in that doe, you weren't doing that on multiple years on the same doe, likely, right?
Yeah, we did have several does.
You did.
Not as many as we'd like, but there were 20 or so that we monitored over multiple years.
Okay.
So we knew whether they were successful or not.
And were there any trends
20,
there?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So about 2/3 of them were either consistently successful or consistently failed. About half and half. And then that other third, it was just sort of a mixed bag. One year they'd get it right, and the next year they would, or vice versa. So you're right. There's no guarantee that a generally successful doe is gonna have her fawns make it every year. But
there's a chance.
Did you witness those? Did you witness like any of those does laying fawns in the same area? Did you pinpoint specific areas that were successful at sheltering fawns from year to year?
No, I mean they have them in somewhere in their home range, but it's not like they come back to the same thicket or even the same drain, hardwood draw, or whatever it is. It doesn't seem to be any rivalry.
You would think that would happen, right? You would think a doe would be like,
this is my secure spot. That's what I was saying.
Just like a bed.
Yeah, this is my secure spot. Yeah, when the gun pressure gets on, or in the South Carolina, when the hounds start wailing through the swamp,
Buck's that like, buck knows,
here's where I go, and I know that I'm not going to get pushed out. Yeah, that's really interesting when you start to. So, I mean, the things that we do know, though, obviously, is that at least in your area, John, if that fawn is born in the latter half of the fawning season, odds are it's dead. It's in trouble. So the earlier it drops, the more chance for survival it has.
Right.
So if we looked at that, if we say like 80% of the fawns in a given cohort are killed by coyotes, if we carved out the ones that are almost 100% guaranteed to die in the later half, and we looked at only the front half of that breeding, is it closer to 50% survival in that front half?
Good question. I hadn't looked at it, broken it out.
I'm picking at details out of that, but I'm just thinking in terms of that earlier breeding group. Look at that as an individual cohort versus the whole fawning season. I would assume that it's higher than 20. We know that if most of the fawns are getting eaten at the end point, that front half may be closer to 40 or 50%.
Yeah.
Maybe that's where the swamping is happening. That there's only so many that they can handle, or at the same time they're having pups, so they're not as active. I don't know. Something could be correlated there.
Starts to get overwhelming from a deer manager standpoint. It's like, man, it could be so many things.
It's defeating as a deer manager, because as a deer manager, I'm taught to shoot all the coyotes I can, trap all the coyotes I can, and put all this effort into it. And frankly, it may not yield anything for me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where it comes down to.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that I know spend a lot of time and money either running trap lines and or hunting or buying $5,000 thermal rifle scopes to kill every coyote they see. It's not making a difference. It might make you feel better and sleep better at night, but scientifically, it's not likely making a difference on your deer herd.
What is the... Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, if somebody is putting forth that effort and feels like they're seeing a difference, and especially if they've got some evidence to back it up, like recruitment rates from a camera survey.
Sure.
I'm not saying it can't work.
Right.
I'm just saying
it's a steep hill to climb right now.
We haven't seen it work.
Yeah.
What is the term for like the phenomenon that, whether it's true or not, that the coyotes, like if you start killing coyotes, that they adapt and actually breed more, or like their biology will tell them to have more pups? Is that a real thing? And what is that called?
I'm not sure what name you're referring to, but it is a real thing that their litter size increases, age at first breeding can increase, the proportion of the female population that breeds can increase.
Is there a term for that?
Can respond by cranking out more pups.
Is there a term?
What we saw I'm sorry?
Is there a term for that? What do you guys call that?
Compensatory reproduction, maybe, something like that. Okay. Not sure that's what you're referring to.
Sounds right.
Well, everybody that, likes to think they know something about coyotes is like, well, if you kill them, like, they'll actually adapt and have more. And I'm like, oh.
Like you cut its head off and two form back?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, that's probably what it feels like.
We did see all three of those variables increase when we started
taking them out.
Wow.
But overall, because there were so few, because we took out so many breeding females,
mm-hmm.
The overall productivity of the population was depressed.
Right.
So even though the ones that were left had higher litters or bigger litters,
mm-hmm.
There weren't as many litters being had, so there weren't as many pups being born.
I gotcha. That makes sense.
All right, I'm just having fun with this one. What do you think would happen if you could contaminate as many fawns as possible in a way that any coyotes that ate them died?
I don't.
What would happen to the coyote population?
That they died if they ate a fawn?
Yep.
Well, I mean, that's what we've been doing for 150 years, poisoning coyotes with, predator control programs out west, for example. And the result is now we've got them not just out west, but all over the continent. They're
interesting.
They're going to figure it out.
It's funny you mentioned that. Jeremy and I picked up a lease in Ohio last year,
mm-hmm.
and we were out cruising the thing, and there was little meat trays everywhere. Like you see at when you buy hamburgers, like the top's clear plastic wrap, underneath is a little black
little
tray.
foam tray.
We were finding them everywhere on this piece of property. I was like picking them up. I thought it was trash.
Yeah, people littering.
As the landowner was poisoning raccoons.
Yeah.
Raccoons?
Yeah, and everything else that ate it.
I don't know what, shoving his Percocets in there or something. But
I don't know, man. It's crazy, though. I mean, because, again, if you I guess it's kind of like the hog situation, John. I mean, ultimately, how much effort and time is put in to try to go to shoot hogs and stuff. And yet they're everywhere, and probably expanding in areas.
Yeah, we're literally flying helicopters and
shooting everyone we can. I had a client in Alabama who had a property high fenced on 3 sides and a river on the 4th. And every year he would take a helicopter and he'd shoot 350 pigs. Every year, though, it just kept filling up. They kept swimming the river and coming in, and kept swimming the river, because the resources were there. They had food plots. They had supplemental feed.
For sure we're crossing the river, not replicating
for
within.
Sure. No, because, I mean, he was to the point where you couldn't find one at the end of the season. And then next year, shoot 350 more because they just moved in again. It's that sponge effect. And that's the downfall is, like, ultimately, if you're a deer manager who's trying to increase the habitat quality and deer quality on your property, you can remove all the coyotes you want. They still want to come to your property because it's teed up to be the best resource for them.
Yeah, talk about a productive animal.
Yeah.
Pigs, they have litters, 6, 7, 8 pigs, and they can do it twice a year, and they can do it at 6 months of age. And that's definitely an uphill battle, and they are spreading, mainly because people are spreading them, moving them to new areas to have something to hunt. But it turns out that we're learning more about controlling them, and you can do it. Like with coyotes, it takes a lot of effort and expense, and we're never going to get rid of them, and certainly in areas where they're well established. Southeast, but you can do some good with controlling pigs.
So, John, I guess from let's just call it like a landowner situation, right? The guy who owns 100 acres or a couple hundred acres. I mean, he might listen to this thing and think, well, what can I do, right? And I guess that is the question, when it comes to predation, and his population. Number one, and I think you repeated it a couple times, is that he's got to control his trigger, right? I mean, that if he's wanting to affect his deer population, that's going to be the one thing he can control, or she can control. But beyond that, I mean, would you still encourage them to be running trap lines and things like that to attempt to control the predator population?
I wouldn't encourage it, but I wouldn't discourage it if they are so inclined and have the means to do it. I just would make sure they understood that it's not a guaranteed success.
Yep.
And I would urge them to do everything they can to improve the habitat.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean that's going to be your best bet is if you can improve the habitat, you've got the best chance, hopefully, to improve the deer.
It seems like your time is better spent
on the habitat
overall. Yeah, on the habitat. You know, the deer are going to benefit from it from a food standpoint and a cover standpoint.
Alternative food sources for the coyotes.
You know, and yeah, I think that's probably the move. That's going to be more effective than trying to kill coyotes.
So before we wrap this up, John, I guess any new research you guys have going on down there at Savannah River site that might be of interest to any of the deer gurus listening to this podcast?
Well, I've touched on. I mentioned that presentation I recently gave about the good mothers versus bad mothers. We've been doing some work on, as far as pigs are concerned, on influences of pig populations on deer. And that's not been very conclusive at this point. Deer certainly avoid pigs. We haven't shown any, or haven't been able to show any detrimental effect of pigs on deer, other than the fact that deer don't like pigs, they're going to get out of the way.
Right.
It'd be the habitat though, right, John? Just like cattle, you know, I don't think deer dislike cattle, but certainly cattle have an impact on the habitat, and so they avoid those areas.
Well, they both eat acorns, for example.
Yep.
So pigs and deer are competing for acorns and other things. But they do use the same habitat. So they're coexisting out there, bumping into each other all the time. And it seems, from what we've seen so far, it's just a matter of deer sort of giving pigs their space.
Sure. Yeah, I'm moving on.
Any real detrimental impact on the deer.
You think they cross on the other side of the road, other side of the sidewalk?
They do.
They see a pig coming.
Step out of line. Great. Well, I guess hopefully we talked about, I don't think we were recording yet. We talked about Southeast Deer Study Group this year in Louisiana, and hopefully that's an in-person event come February or early March next year versus what's been virtual the last 2 years. But no, John, we appreciate you coming on, man, and shedding some light on some of the research that you found. I know we get a lot of people talking about predation and coyotes on their property, and you know, it's a huge thing in this industry that's just been continuing to build up. And ultimately, you know, again, it's not to discourage anybody about it, but you're going to have some really realistic expectations on how impactful you're going to be with a gun and a thermal scope on your property calling coyotes, and what that looks like from a landscape level impact ultimately.
Right.
Perfect. Where can people check out any of the research publications and stuff for you? Do you have them on the Savannah River site website?
The Southern Research Station website.
Okay.
That's U.S. Forest Service.
Okay.
Just Google Forest Service Southern Research Station and my name, and you'll find them.
Okay. Perfect. All right, Dr. John Kilgo. Well, we appreciate you coming on the HUNTR Podcast, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Cool. Crazy, though, man. I mean, think about that. I mean, I know he's talking 25,000 acres in that coyote removal. I mean, that's the number that's sticking in my head. Over 400 coyotes removed, and it didn't move the needle on survival.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
You know, it's still coyotes moving right back in and killing those things. I mean, that just, and again, if you think about, like, we've all, especially it seems like in the last 5 years, it's like, oh, yep, there's a coyote in that field, or there's a coyote in that field. But again, it's kind of like the big buck thing. Like, think about how many coyotes you never get eyes on that are there, that are out there. And that kind of just continues to explain it, in that, you know, we can remove all these coyotes from this area for 3 consecutive years, and whatever coyotes are still remaining and have moved in still do the same amount of damage.
Yeah. Regardless of if there's other predators and stuff. So.
And regardless of habitat, you know, it doesn't matter if it's an edge or if it's an open forest. Like, and I think that's, you know, hopefully people aren't listening to this and getting completely discouraged, but you know, it kind of goes back to you and I opening this podcast and saying, well, you know, I've tried to do a little food plot work and habitat work here because it's all we have time for. I don't have as much time to run trap lines and hunt coyotes as I'd like to. But my priority is deer and deer management anyways. Doesn't sound like it'd be worth it to sacrifice my time to do anyways. If my goal was to kill coyotes because I love to enjoy that, then yeah, go out and hunt coyotes, go trap coyotes, do that for sure. But if your goal is to improve the recruitment rate of fawns on your property and improve your deer population, and you're strapped on time, don't go try to kill coyotes because it ain't gonna help.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had some more clear answers at the end of it. Like, I'm not sure what you can do to improve it.
It sounds like habitat.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It's weird because, like,
Craig Harper's ringing in my head like, just leave it go, man.
Just let it go.
It's going to bring the deer back. Don't worry about the coyote. That's how it'll be. But he's right, though. I mean, ultimately, that is the two things you can change. You can work and improve your habitat, and you can control what you shoot. Other than that,
yeah,
you can hunt as many coyotes as you want. You can run as many trap lines as you want. And again, if you did it for 5-10 consecutive years, yeah, I think you'd make a dent and you'd start to change things. And you'd see that you'd have to run a trail camera survey. You'd have to measure your fawn recruitment rates via that trail camera survey. If you're just doing it and saying, oh yeah, it's improving it, you're lost. You have to be collecting data. You have to be doing, that's when we've talked about doing a survey on your property forever. You have to run a survey year after year at the same consistent times each year to be able to see those trends. If you're not doing that, or you're not looking at the reproduction rate when you shoot does and stuff, you don't have data to support an observation that says, yeah, I killed 10 coyotes last year and it made a huge difference on my deer herd. You don't know that. You have no idea. It's just how it is.
It is interesting. There's,
just another wrinkle.
It's just hard to know, whether it's.
Now, don't get me wrong. If I am hunting turkeys this weekend and I call on a coyote, I'm going to shoot it in its face.
Sure.
But to actively take the time to try to kill coyotes to improve my herd ain't going to happen. It's not, I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just don't stress yourself out trying to reduce your coyote population. Just, carry 22 with you and take the opportunity when you get it and work on your habitat improvement overall, just because it's going to benefit all wildlife and your experience on the property.
I think the other thing is if you think that you don't have enough deer, like if you're truly concerned about it, habitat, number one. Number two is don't shoot does or don't shoot as many does.
Yeah.
Those are the two things that are going to get you more deer on your property. Improved habitat, less doe harvest.
Dude, mine is still kind of, it baffles me a little bit because it's like, it's not the greatest habitat in the world by any means. You've been out to my place.
Yes.
We have a ton of deer, a pile, too many. I also have a ton of coyotes, ton of them. Every time I go out, I see coyotes.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I'm sure they're taking
and we shoot a fair amount of does we're surrounded by Amish communities. They're killing does.
I think it's because the one thing you don't ever lack on your property year round is food. And that's probably going to keep a healthier herd, which is going to increase their normal reproduction rates. So sure, you're taking off some does. Some fawns are getting killed by coyotes. But ultimately, your reproduction rates are probably super high to begin with. So when you bring it down, maybe it's a 50% survival rate.
Yeah.
Because think of some of the areas, this isn't, the southeast especially is extremely different than what we see in a lot of areas. Like if we take places in Iowa.
Seems like a weird place.
It is. if you take places in Iowa, Western Kentucky, Illinois, even in the really good ag country of Ohio, some of those areas in isolated populations, you may see reproduction rates of 1.5, which means every doe is having 1.5 fawns survive to at least 6 months of age. That's the recruitment rate, 1.5. Even if they start at an average of 1.5 and you've got coyote predation in there for 50%, you're still at a 1. John's talking about 0.2 where he's at. So it's a lot of the habitat type and quality and health of the herd, which I think ties into habitat, but it's because of soil fertility. And then that gives you a baseline. If your baseline is 1, let's say John's is baseline of 1, well, yeah, 80% mortality by coyotes puts you at 0.2. right? If your baseline's 1.5, 80% mortality from coyotes puts you at a 0.7. That's 3 times the amount of fawns that John's seeing.
Yeah.
So when you listen to this, you got to put yourself in a habitat. I would say that my Pennsylvania and my Kentucky properties are probably closer to John's southeast. Mountainous, not as much food, not as good as soil fertility. So maybe they're starting at a 1, and maybe I don't have as impactful of the coyotes that he has, but maybe it's now at a 0.5. My Ohio place is probably less than yours, but in between, maybe it's at 1.25. Your Ohio place might be at 1.5. So, all of a sudden we may be down at 0.8 to 1. Again, that's 4 to 5 times the recruitment that John's seeing. So that means we're recruiting 4 to 5 times more fawns into the population every year than he is in the Southeast. And I've done plenty of Mississippi and Alabama trail camera surveys when I've been in 0.2, 0.25 for survival rate. And so again, when I say, hey, listen, we need to take some deer off, but it's not because, of your fawn recruitment. It's because you have too many deer to begin with, right? I want to take some off and bring that herd down. And I know you're only adding 25% of the fawns back in. Where most of the people in the Midwest and Northeast and decent habitat and decent soil fertility are, even with a 50% or 80% coyote mortality and black bear mortality or whatever else, you might be sitting at 0.7 to 0.8 to 1. That's a lot of fawns still coming back into the population. When you're listening to this, think of where you sit and where your property sits in the extreme there. And the only way you can tell is do a trail camera survey. And usually July, August, or September, and late July, but August, September are the two most likely. Do a trail camera survey, count the number of fawns to number of does, and then you have to unique the bucks, right? If you've never looked at a trail camera survey before, go to Mississippi State Deer Lab, search for trail camera survey, and it'll tell you exactly how to do it. You'll get a recruitment number. That's where we're talking about this 0.2 or 0.8 or 0.7 or 1.0. You'll get a recruitment rate. And do that at around the same time every year. And when you have 2 or 3 years of data, you'll be able to say, okay, every year it seems like I've got 0.4% or 0.4 fawn recruitment, which is a 40% fawn survival. And now you'll be able to see. And if you're wanting to take coyotes off, now you have a trend to say, okay, I'm going to go and try to kill as many coyotes as possible. Great. What was that recruitment the next year? Still 0.4? Didn't change anything. Didn't affect anything. I think in Pennsylvania, black bears have a bigger impact than coyotes, 100%. And the problem is I can only take 1 black bear a year. And there's not that many black bear hunters, and the success rate for black bear hunters in the state of Pennsylvania is very low because we can't use bait. It's just go out there and kill them. Most of our gun season, those bears have already started to hit their dormancy in state of torpor, where they're going under for hibernation. So if that is the biggest impact of a predator on my deer population, how am I supposed to make an impact on it? It's tough. At least with coyotes, I can shoot as many as I want anytime I want, including Sundays. So, yeah. Anyways, that's my rant.
Yeah, no, it's just...
Habitat and what you shoot is the only things that, if you want to take something from this podcast, invest in your habitat and do a camera survey so you know what you should shoot. That's it. That's what you should do.
Yeah. And I think just appreciate what you have for what it is.
I mean, I'll be the first to say that
because it's tough to make a difference.
There are definitely times I've been in the deer stand that a coyote's come through and I don't even pick up the bow. I just watch it because it's a cool animal to watch. Should I kill it?
I've never done that. I've shot every single one I've ever seen.
Yeah, I've watched them. I've just watched them go by because they're just a cool animal to see. And yeah, if I kill that one, maybe I save a couple fawns, maybe I don't. I don't know. Apparently now, hearing John...
That has been my motivator, though. It's not like I shoot him just because I want to shoot something.
You shoot him because you think you're saving fawns.
I shoot him because I think I'm saving fawns. Which...
Well, and I'm not saying don't shoot him because, again, if I call one in for turkey season Saturday, I will shoot it.
Sure.
But there's been plenty that I've watched, and I usually try to, squeak them in, and if they don't respond, then, I just watch them. I don't try to get worked up about it, but... There's a lot of guys that are very serious about it and spend a lot of money to kill coyotes. And I think we'll listen to this podcast and say, you guys are full of shit. I know that if I kill 10 coyotes this year, it's going to...
can't say that. We're not making a statement. We're just...
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just, that's what the research says.
Yeah.
You can kill as many as you want, and it's probably not going to make a big difference on your deer. But they will think that if you ask them if they do a camera survey to prove it, the answer will be no. Because they don't do one, and they don't have the data. Observationally, they think it's making a difference, and it's whatever makes them feel better.
In fairness, those trail camera surveys are in question too, right?
If you do it consistently at the same time every year, or about the same time every year, it's not so much the numbers as much as the trend that you're looking at, right? So the numbers are going to be ballpark plus or minus. But let's say you do 3 years of those and you look at your fawn survival rate. Then you start doing intense trapping and killing of coyotes. If it increases, then you know that there's an effect of taking those off.
Sure, but that's only relevant for that time of the year when the survey's taken.
Correct.
Because deer herds fluctuate throughout the year.
Correct.
Massively.
It's a snapshot in time. Yep. And your recruitment is usually to get them to December, January. That's the 6-month cycle.
Well, and it just gets even more convoluted when you throw in the fact that, most buck fawns anyways aren't staying on your property anyways.
Mm-hmm. And in many states, they harvest a ton of fawns in antlerless season.
Sure.
Button bucks and doe fawns. I think what John was getting at there is that 80% that he was seeing in the recruitment side was in the first 2 to 3 weeks, basically. That's when they're killing all those fawns. After that, it probably gets easier. And I would say once you get to that fawn being 2 months old, between 2 and 6 months, 6 months is what we call that recruitment phase, basically to where it could be part of the breeding population. The number one predator is humans in hunting. Has to be. Because, I don't think coyotes are eating 4 and 5 month old fawns. People are shooting 4 and 5 month old fawns.
As frequently. I'm sure they do eat
But in that first 2 to 3 weeks, we're not shooting any fawns. They're getting eaten by coyotes. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take some time to process this one.
Yeah. My goal is to continue to invest in the habitat.
Yeah, maybe even a better mindset to come away from this thing is like that. There just are some things that you can't change.
You can't change. You can't control.
Yeah, and that's just, you got to learn how to operate in that infrastructure. That's life, dude. There's lots of things you can't affect. So.
Yep, agree. All right. Well, we appreciate everyone listening to this episode of the HUNTR Podcast 72 with Dr. John Kilgo of the Savannah River site, talking about coyotes and deer depredation. And I'm not sure what we got lined up next week. We don't have anything yet.
I'm sure we'll figure it out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. You got something coming at you. But we appreciate you all listening. We'll see y'all next week. Later.